thank you everyone for being participating this morning in France and maybe later in the day in Japan to this webinar organized by FRS, Fondation for Strategic Research Japan program. And it will focus, this first seminar will focus on the actuality of the San Franciso Treaty. As you all know, the anniversary of the signature of the San Franciso Treaty will be next week. And it's a very good opportunity to ask ourselves questions about the stability of the architecture that emerged after the San Franciso Treaty, and particularly the very important role of Japan that has been increasing in recent years, but also the roles of external powers who were not as involved as the US, UK, Netherlands. UK and Netherlands recently, but I'm sure Professor Hosoya will come back to this, participated, I think a few days ago, yesterday, to maneuvers with Japan, but also France, that has been extremely active in the Asia-Pacific for many reasons. So we will have a very, I'm sure, interesting discussion with two excellent speakers. Ladies first, so Marianne Peron-Doise, first, she is an old friend and I thank her for participating to this webinar, but she is also a former French Navy officer. She is an expert on global maritime topics and Northeast Asia. She wrote extensively, for instance, on North Korea. And she's now Associate Research Fellow at IRIS, the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. And she also teaches at Sciences Po on maritime security. We have also Professor Hosoya, also an old friend. He's a very well-known, extremely well-known and important historian in Japan, and he's a professor at Keio University. And above all, he's also an expert on Japan, East Asia, international relations and security, and I may say a very important advisor to many people in Japan on these issues. So I will first give the floor to Professor Hosoya for approximately 15 minutes, then directly to Marianne, and after that I will relay the questions that you can put on the chat with the chat button at the bottom of your screen, so we can launch a discussion until 11 French time or 6 Japan time. Thank you very much. So, Professor Hosoya, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Niquet-san, for your very kind introduction. I'm particularly very glad to join in this conference today, webinar today, because we are focusing on the San Francisco Peace Treaty and its relevance to understand the current international relations in the Pacific, because I strongly believe that there is a very strong link between the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the current international relations in the Pacific. Particularly yesterday, there was a joint military exercise near Okinawa in the Pacific Ocean among British Royal Navy and American Navy and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces. And in addition to these countries, the Netherlands Navy also joined in the joint military exercise. It's interesting to know that these powers, UK, US, and also the Netherlands, these are the major powers who actually drafted and then concluded the Japanese Peace Treaty. Of course, France played a very important role because France, of course, is and at the time was the one of the 5 permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So that's why it's natural for French government to play a leading role in creating the San Francisco Peace Treaty. And interestingly, France is a key country in Europe who actually has led the new strategy towards the Indo-Pacific. French government for the first time published important strategic document in the Indo-Pacific, and the other European government actually followed that case. I mean, the Netherlands and the Germany and partly the UK government in its integrated review actually created an important vision and strategy for the Indo-Pacific region. So we can see some link between the two. I mean, the San Franciso Peace Treaty of 1951 and the current international relations in the Indo-Pacific. And this year, 2021 marks 70th anniversary of the San Francisco Peace Conference. Of course, naturally, September 8th was a day, and next month we will celebrate a 70th anniversary of the Peace Conference. And the Peace Treaty is important to understand the current international relation in the region, as I said, because Peace Treaty, Japanese Peace Treaty, or the San Francisco Peace Treaty actually created the foundation of the basic framework of international order in the region. So it is still very important to understand the meaning and the basic nature of the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951. But in the last 3 or 4 decades, in Japan and of course outside of Japan as well, we have not seen significant advance in the historical study of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. In 1980s, there were several very good publications in Japanese language on the research because of the declassification of important documents in Japan, in the UK, and in the US governments. That's why we could see some of the very important new historical researches on the Japanese Peace Treaty in the 1980s. But since then, we have not seen significant advance in the field. But we are now, together with some other Japanese historians, we are now editing a new volume on the San Francisco Peace Treaty, and maybe next year we will publish both Japanese and English version of new research on the Japanese Peace Treaty, San Francisco Peace Treaty, and we will include some of the new elements of Asian governments, because basically we have not fully understood how leading Asian countries actually joined in that system, San Francisco system, after 1945. So in the sense, we will have much deeper, much clearer understanding on the nature of international order created by San Francisco Peace Treaty. And I will talk in my 10 minutes a basic outline of why it is important to understand the San Francisco Peace Treaty and how we should link the two things. On one hand, we have San Francisco Peace Treaty. On the other hand, we are seeing the current development in Indo-Pacific international strategic relations. First of all, I like to go back to the basic historical trajectory in the region. This is a region with huge Eurasian continent, and just along the line of the coast of Eurasian continent, we have seen basically the geopolitical confrontation between sea powers and the continental powers. Sea powers, of course, are UK, US, partly, of course, France and Japan. And the continental powers are, of course, Soviet Union or Russian Empire, currently Russia and China. So we have continuously seen a kind of geopolitical confrontation between the two sides, I mean the sea powers and the continental powers. And along the line of the confrontation, we have seen some of the wars, like Indonesian War in the Indonesian peninsula, and the Korean War in the Korean peninsula. And of course, Afghanistan was the main theater of the great game between Russian Empire and British Empire. So we can have a big picture of rivalry between sea powers and the continental power. So this is a basic framework of the geopolitical confrontations between the two sides in the last 200 years. Then I move to the next framework. After 1945, the biggest change created by the Second World War or the Pacific War was the defeat of Japan and this war and the demise of the great Japanese Empire at that time. By seeing the demise of the Japanese Empire, it was necessary to settle peace in the area of this Japanese Empire, particularly Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and Pacific Islands, and the Korean Peninsula. And then two sides during the Cold War, beginning of the Cold War, I mean the United States on one hand, and the Soviet Union on the other hand. They, the two superpowers, try to occupy their respective zones in Korean Peninsula and Vietnam or some other areas. And then we have seen the development in the Cold War in Asia. So the Cold War was basically initiated by the demise of Japanese Empire. How to settle that instability and how to fulfill the power vacuum created by the demise of Japanese Empire. And then it was important for the United States to restore the balance of power in the region. The key figure was George F. Kennan. In 1947, as you might know well, George Kennan became the director of the policy planning staff, but he was Russian expert, and he was not Asian expert. So he met with one of the leading China experts of the time, or one of the best Asian experts within American Department of State. And his name was John Mcmurray. John Mcmurray was within the State Department until 1946. And he wrote a very important memorandum in 1935. And it was basically called Mcmurray Memorandum, in which he said that the United States should avoid the war with Japan, because if the war happened, he was sure, he wrote in his memorandum in 1935, Mcmurray, when he was a diplomat within American State Department, he wrote that it was quite sure that the United States could defeat Japan. By defeating Japan, it would create huge power vacuum. And it was natural to understand or to predict that either China or Russia would fulfill the power vacuum. That's why he wrote that in his memorandum in 1935, John Mcmurray wrote that the United States shouldn't defeat Japan because it would create a huge power vacuum. And the United States cannot actually maintain their forces in Asian soil. It was quite similar understanding to the current situation in Afghanistan. United States can easily defeat the enemy in Asia, but United States cannot eternally, permanently station their forces, troops on Asian soil. That's why United States would easily evacuate from Asia. And then the competing power or enemy would fulfill the power vacuum. After 1945, suddenly, both Soviet Union and the Communist China were beginning to fulfill the power vacuum in Asian continent instead of the United States. And the United States in 1950 actually drew a line of the defensive perimeter declared by, at the time, Secretary of State Dean Acheson in January 1950. And the Acheson declared that the United States was not willing to maintain their forces in Asian continent. It was quite clear, it was quite similar to what President Joe Biden said. Now, of course, the United States can defeat the enemy in the Korean War, but it was impossible for the United States. It is impossible for the United States to maintain their forces eternally. That's why the United States always need to think about balance of power. And to restore the balance of power, it was necessary for the United States to have Japan within the Western camp. That's why George Kennan began to change American strategy towards both Germany, Western Germany, and towards Japan, to try to tie these great powers, Western Germany and Japan, with the Western alliance. Beforehand, the main aim for the United States government was to disarm Japan, demise Japanese empire, and demobilize and demilitarize Japan. it all, of course, naturally weakened Japan, and weakened Japan would easily become the power vacuum in the area. That's why it was important for the US government to make Japan a quite friendly allied power to the United States or to the Western Alliance. So 1949, 1950, the United States government changed its policy, had been changing its strategies towards the region to try to have Japan within the Western Alliance. But it was the time of the Cold War. Maybe it took another decade to try to create an agreement with both Soviet Union and the Communist China, because the Korean War happened in June 1950. Well, then the United States once again changed its strategy towards Asia by abandoning both Soviet Union and Communist China. United States government began to think that it was necessary to create an international order led by both United States and United Kingdom, of course, together with France, Netherlands, and other countries. And those who can join in the peace treaty or peace conference would be welcomed. So 49 countries actually joined in the San Francisco Peace Conference in September 1951. And these countries, let me name some of the countries, the names of some of the countries who actually joined in the San Francisco Peace Conference. Also, United States, United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, of course, and Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Canada, and after that, India and Taiwan, or Republic of China, concluded the bilateral peace treaty with Japan, respectively. So all these countries, India, Taiwan together, these are the core of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And these are the countries now who are sided with basically the United States. And all the Quad parts, United States, Australia, Japan, and India, are within that peace treaty system. So this is the core or the foundation of the the foundation of the San Francisco peace system. But one of the biggest problems was that the system actually did not include important Asian powers such as Korea and China. That's why it took actually 2 decades for the Japanese government to conclude important friendly cooperative relations or treaty with South Korea and Communist China. It was 1965 when Japan concluded the basic treaty with South Korean government, and it was not until 1978 when Japanese government could finally conclude a peace treaty, a kind of a peace treaty with Beijing government. So it took 2 or 3 decades to come to the point. But anyway, the basic frame was already created by US government and UK government in 1951, September 1941. So it is we have 2-tier system in the Indo-Pacific. The first tier was created by UK-US, and the second tier we include in China, South Korea, Soviet Union, and other countries. So this is the basic nature of the current strategic, relationship, or the current foundation of the current international order in the region. It remains. The point is whether we can include really both South Korea and China in that system. That's why it would be natural that China has been a kind of a revisionist power in the region to try to modify and to transform the basic nature of the international order in the region. Because Chinese government now thinks that it is powerful enough to transform that. So I stop here. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Hosoya, for this, in a very short time, broad and extremely deep analysis of what was the fundamentals of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. And now I turn to Marianne Peron-Doise to follow up and give her own input on this subject. Marianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. And of course, thank you to the FFS for inviting me to this speaking event in company of Hosoya Sensor that I greet very, very friendly. So I think that this is a topic and the relevance and the actuality of the San Francisco Treaty and the current situation of the US alliance in the Indo-Pacific is very relevant at a moment where we can see quite a chaotic withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan, and I guess where many countries are questioning about the credibility of engaging a long-term strategic partnership with Washington, and from a more general perspective are maybe questioning about Washington long-term diplomatic objective in the Indo-Pacific. And from what I can understand, I think that this American retreat from Afghanistan after Iraq correspond to a kind of American renunciation of being a global security actor, or in other words, the world's policeman, le gendarme du monde, in order to refocus on objectives and a region deemed to be priority. That's mean the Indo-Pacific. And this region has become really crucial because of the emergence of a new powers that tend to compete with the United States for leadership. I'm of course talking about China, which has become a strategic competitor for Washington in the economic, in the political, and in the military field, but also in the field of values and the system of governance. And this is why the traditional alliance system on which the United States has relied since the end of the Second World War need to be rethinked. New partnership must be explored because the nature of the threat to the international system are not solely military by nature, like during the Cold War, but reside in a kind of power of attraction of the Chinese model of governance and an alternative narrative proposing new rules for the international system. And this is why in my presentation, I will try to mention the growing role of new regional organization and the situation, the place that ASEAN and the EU as regional organization are claiming as actor of the security of the Indo-Pacific, but also as a normative power. I think that the San Francisco Treaty that was signed between Japan, a large number of states, but also between Japan and the United States, led to the emergence of what has been described as the San Francisco system, with the predominance of a Pax Americana in Asia, with the establishment of a myriad of security treaties. We all know that, first with Japan, then after the Korean War with South Korea. In Southeast Asia, Washington signed a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, signed a defense agreement with Thailand, and I will not forget to mention Australia, with whom a security agreement was also signed, including also at this time New Zealand, as known as ANZUS. We remember that New Zealand anti-nuclear stance led to its withdrawal in 1980. But all of these treaties signed for the most part in the post-war period are bilateral treaties and establishing an asymmetrical relationship between a partner, the United States, whose economic, political, and military resources are far superior to those of the other contracting party. At the moment of the signature of this treaty, Japan is occupied. South Korea is slightly recovering from the war with difficulty, with a declared enemy born of the partition of the country, North Korea. The Philippines were newly independent, and Manila was recovering from the Japanese occupation. And since 1940, Thailand and Manila have received substantial military assistance from the United States, training and significant transfer of equipment. Thailand has been designed by Washington as a very major non-NATO ally and is hosting an annual multinational training exercise, one of the largest multinational exercises led by the US military forces in Southeast Asia, named Cobra Gold, to which China has been occasionally invited. All of this agreement and defense relation became very important for the stability of the post-World War period and international relation in the Asia-Pacific region, despite existence of conflict in Vietnam, in Korea. And thus, I think that the San Francisco system, which was a product of this bilateral security relation, reflected the strategic priority and military consent of Washington. And this exclusive alliance with Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Thailand, and Australia has been for decades forming the hub and spoke security model. And this model, of course, faced turbulence. It has to be reconfigured to rebalance the relationship between the United States and its partner, to take a better account of their own security concern, but also their aspiration for greater strategic autonomy, but also to include a burden sharing issue. And it is interesting, in my view, to note that the United States wished to attenuate the formal and hierarchical aspect of its alliance, more and more criticized and negatively perceived by the public opinion of certain partners, such as Philippines, such as South Korea, in order to make it a more regional system, organized as a network in order to increase its interoperability and military capability, that is to say, its strategic relevance. And it was a question of the United States to proceed to readjustment, implementation of new security measures, elaboration of new guidelines, to show that they were not the only beneficiary of this system, but that all allies and partners could benefit from it. And of course, this alliance system of United States in Asia cannot be compared to what NATO represents in Europe, of course, and to the degree of political and military integration of all member states within this organization. US security alliance in Asia may have evolved into form of mini-lateralism, but even more advanced military relation between close allies, as Japan and South Korea never reached a significant degree of operational integration. And over time, it seems to me that the San Francisco system objective in Asia from US perspective became to maintain stable relations with China, whose economic and military emergence threatened a regional order dominated by the American security guarantee. And at a certain point, I think that American ambition may have been to preserve the balance of power, to avoid conflict with China, and to maintain equilibrated economic trade relations with Beijing at, I would say, at an acceptable cost. And it was indubitably the bet of the Obama administration, but it was not taking into account many elements that no longer corresponded with the geopolitical reality sorry, of the region. And in a nutshell, the faster than expected development of Chinese military power and Chinese assertiveness have rendered this traditional framework of American alliance in Asia quite obsolete. And this is what President Trump has understood in his own way by adopting a very confrontational vision of international relations. According to this vision in Asia, the United States must retain their preeminence, and to do so hinder the development of Chinese diplomatic influence and Chinese economic and military capacity. And for that, President Trump has taken up the concept of Indo-Pacific and the quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad, comprising the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, as leverage, as instrument in a policy of containment against China. And this may explain maybe the reluctance of India, of Australia at the very beginning to join this initiative. And this also explains why the Biden administration wanted to give a more global orientation to this mechanism and to elaborate a new, a more inclusive Quad, which still have a military dimension with regular naval exercise, but is also working in a more multilateral way to organize a common answer to fight the COVID-19, to fight climate change, to protect the critical technology, and to implement quality infrastructure. And of course, there are different visions between the close partner claiming to have an Indo-Pacific vision of the Indo-Pacific. And I think that the Trump use of the concept of Indo-Pacific was not the initial vision of a Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2006, when he moved closer to India by developing his perception of the connectivity between the Indian Ocean and Pacific, the existence of common security interest between these two maritime theaters and the neighboring country. But of course, speaking of preserving open and free, the major sea lane of communication made sense. And also for Japan and United States to have India on their side when trying to counter Chinese emergence and China maritime assertiveness. So at the time of Trump presidency in 2015, the ASEAN geopolitical context changed quite a lot, with China able to make a regional and international order more in line with its strategic interests. And this is clearly perceptible in the implementation of the Chinese BRI project in 2013. The BRI project, whose deployment in the Indian Ocean worried quite a lot India. But as you know, the point of arrival of the BRI is EU, is Europe, and Brussels and also some EU member states are wondering about Chinese intention and agenda at this moment. And of course, this perception, this awareness of a potential ASEAN regional disruption by China that has a direct impact on Europe's stability and prosperity has led the EU to move closer to ASEAN, to strengthen its framework for political dialogue and its strategic partnership with ASEAN powers, and to adopt a more consistent ASEAN policy. And the EU commitment to increase its relation with ASEAN is notably illustrated by the adoption of what Hosoya-sensei already mentioned, this new EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, after several EU member states, France, Germany, and Netherlands, has already done at the national level. And the basic message is that the EU will work with its partner in the Indo-Pacific to respond to emerging and maybe divergent dynamic that are affecting regional stability. And this cooperative approach is very, very close to ASEAN's own outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And in the security field, just to give a few examples, the EU is already organizing high-level dialogue on maritime security and sustainable development with ASEAN, as co-chair a number of initiatives within the ASEAN Regional Forum framework, including meeting on counterterrorism and currently on maritime security. And I believe that the willingness of both the EU and the ASEAN to assume a greater role as an actor of regional security for the Indo-Pacific is a very important element, especially since the two organizations wish to support strategically each other. Both organizations can help to set a cooperative mechanism that can threaten regional security. And of course, without replacing a system of alliance or institutional security relation, I think that maybe EU can develop maritime security building initiative and contribute more effectively to stability and good order at sea in the Indo-Pacific. The EU has been a very active player in fighting piracy in the Indian Ocean with a naval operation Atalanta established in 2008 and still active and more involved in the monitoring of illicit activities as drug, arm trafficking, or EU fishing. I think that, and as a conclusion, Valérie, I would say that ASEAN and EU as economic, commercial, and political actors are at the center of the US-China river race. The final destination of the BRI, as I have already mentioned, is Europe, but the strategic priority space for the United States is ASEAN and its maritime extension, the South China Sea, which allow communication between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. I think that both organizations have evolved a lot in terms of security, and it will be wrong to see that they are weak or to say that they are weak actors without military capability or having not strategic credibility. There are important institutional differences between them. There is a Europe of defense, a common security and defense policy with a high representative, Joseph Borrell, who very often travel to Asia and to speak with ASEAN members. Of course, EU and ASEAN weakness stand in the fact that the policy is based on consensus, and we know that China strategy focus on bilateral relation with individual states. But EU and ASEAN has a clear interest with many other partners, including the United States, in maintaining a rule-based order and a freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. Many EU member states expressed concern about the Convention of the Law of the Sea, the Montego Bay Convention. France, Germany, and Netherlands have published strategic documents and guidelines focusing on the importance of the Indo-Pacific. France has a resident power in the Indian Ocean and Oceania has already expressed concern in many strategic papers about impact of China activity in the South China Sea, and is calling for a more visible EU naval presence in the ASEAN water. And I think that EU and ASEAN and EU member states are very important partner, both for the United States And when it came to defend a rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific, they do not have the same perception regarding China, and there are divergences in their China policy. But I think that they can adopt a more cooperative approach when it came to the defense of the international rule-based order. And I will finish there, Valérie.
Thank you very much, Marianne. It was interesting, that balance between history and contemporary challenges. Sorry. And there is no question yet, so I remind the participants that you can use the Q&R button at the bottom of your screen to send comments after these two presentations or questions. Meanwhile, I will just mention a few things. I was fascinated by Professor Hosoya's presentation with, as I said, historical depth, and also the mention he made of the continental powers and maritime powers opposition in East Asia. And I just wanted to say that if you have the opportunity, try to find on the internet a map of Asia, but not as usual, you know, vertically presented, but horizontally presented. And there you see exactly the position of China and that chain of islands, not only islands, but from Korea to the Philippines, Indonesia, that is so clear to make us understand the reality of the necessity of a balance of power today. I don't have this map here, and I don't know how to share a screen, so I cannot help you there, but it is extremely enlightening to see the challenges that countries like Japan, for instance, has to face, but also the United States, beyond that line of islands or territories that really close the China Sea, and you have these two land mass facing that maritime space that needs to be defended in a way. And it leads me to other, okay, I have questions now, I will be quick. A few just remarks or questions that you can deal after I will relay the questions here. I think that, as Marianne said, one of the main differences with the San Francisco Treaty when it was signed is the emergence, of course, of a series of new actors after decolonization process. So now we have these countries in Southeast Asia. You have China that emerged as a significant player, which was not the case at all at the time of the San Francisco Treaty, or if there was a Chinese important player at that time, it was the Republic of China on Taiwan, so which was the case until 1971. And it comes back as a very important issue today. Taiwan issue will be one of the most important challenge to that security system in Asia. There is also one major issue. Marianne mentioned the question of burden sharing. One of the major issues, of course, is for Japan, how up to what point can Japan really share the burden, not in terms of of financing the bases or whatever, or military spending, but in terms of being able to act as a military power, in a way, let's say the world, in a world that is more and more difficult and unstable, as we saw recently in Afghanistan. By the way, Japan sent, the Japan Air Self-Defenses sent a plane, I know, to Kabul after some delay and some remarks from outside saying that Japan was the only power among the G7 not to have sent a plane yet. So there will be tremendous challenges for Japan and Japan political leadership and public opinion about what it can do more and more in terms of sharing the burden, especially with the question of reassurance from the United States. We know that the United States want to refocus in East Asia, and it started under Obama. And they reasserted this, including Joe Biden in his later speech, but still questions are asked, and countries like China are playing on the fact that can we trust the United States? up to the end, I mean, up to the really, when there are real challenges. So these are the two remarks I wanted to make, and now I will look at the questions. There is a question. Oh, yeah, a question from Pierre Chabal asking if that being a member of, for Japan, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would enhance Japan's security. Actually, it poses another, more globally, another question, maybe to Hosoya sensei, which is the building by China of a counter system, you know, from the San Francisco system. They have their own organizations that they try to sell and project. So is it something that Japan can follow on or not? And this will be one question to Hosoya sensei, and to maybe to Marianne, there is a question about the ARC-21 exercise in May 21 between US, Japan, and France, trilateral for the first time. Do you think that that kind of minilateral or minilateral organization or exercise for each country is important or significant for the Indo-Pacific strategies of France, for instance, or other countries, or Indo-Pacific stability globally, more generally? So the first question is to Hosoya sensei, and the second one to Marianne.
Well, thank you very much. May I answer to the question? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much indeed. For the first question on the Japanese possibility of Japanese participation, perhaps in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization (SCO), I think that basically the nature of the institution or organization is a coalition of continental powers to try to stabilize the Eurasian continent by with the cooperation of kind of a continental powers like Russia, China, and so on. And on the other hand, Japan, as I said, has been basically a shipper, or and in 1910 20s, after Japanese annexation of Korean Peninsula, Japan was trying to become a continental power. To defend the Korean Peninsula, Japan needed to have Manchuria. That's why Japan invaded Manchuria, northern China. Then Japan failed because Japan shouldn't have to become a continental power before 1945. So after 1945, I think that Japan largely abandoned its ambition to become a continental power, or to try to expand its influence in the Asian continent. So on the other hand, Japan is moving southward to become a sea power in collaboration with United States or UK and other like-minded countries. So I think that Japanese people would undoubtedly hesitate to be a member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization because the nature of organization is not a kind of a liberalism or democracy and so on. So that's why I think that this is a quite different kind of organization that Japan would be trying to join. But on the other hand, I think that it has a mission. I mean, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has a mission to create a stability in the Eurasian continent. So that's why Japan has no reason to deny or reject the cooperation among those countries. And if I may, I'd like to ask the other question about Japanese efforts to
Yes.
press China on territorial issues.
Yes.
I think that Japanese military power is quite limited, and China is becoming more powerful. And the size of Chinese military budget, defense budget, is more than 5 times bigger than Japanese defense budget. So it is really difficult for Japan to restore the balance of power in the region with rising Chinese military power. But on the other hand, Japan is doing it in a quite different way. Japan is doing it with the idea of promoting the idea of the rule of law, international cooperation, and multilateral cooperation. And that's why I think that free and open Indo-Pacific vision matters, because more and more countries, not just Australia, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, but European countries as well, more and more countries are quite irritated or frustrated by Chinese efforts ignoring some of the important international norms, including rule of law. So Japanese approach is quite different. But on the other hand, at the same time, I would like to say that power matters. That's why Japan needs to increase its defense budget. Japan needs to increase its security cooperation with like-minded countries, UK, France, Australia, India, and so on. And also, ASEAN is more and more trying to be sided with Japan because, China is becoming more arrogant than before, particularly towards the ASEAN. So that's why I think that, and also China often ignores the importance of ASEAN centrality. And Japan is the only country which has been respecting ASEAN centrality from the beginning, 1967. ASEAN was the organization which tried to prevent the spread of the Chinese communist influence in the Southeast Asia. That's why Japan has been a friend to try to respect and focus on the importance of the ASEAN centrality. That's why Japanese approach is different. But at the same time, Japan needs to increase its security cooperation and increase its defense budget. Otherwise, Japan cannot defend its own territories against expanding Chinese ambitions or expanding Chinese influence in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Marianne, if you want to jump onto that one,
I can jump and made a brief comment on ARC 2021 and this kind of maritime multilateralism, mini-lateralism that we can observe development in the Indo-Pacific. Well, you had a lot of bilateral relation from some countries in the Indo-Pacific, and maybe mini-lateralism offered a more comfortable position for them to develop, I will say, interoperability and maritime exchange than going through a more global structure as Quad. So we can see that France is eager to develop its relation at sea with Japan and to try to develop a more sophisticated exercise at sea. But France as a resident power has bilateral close relation with India, with Australia, and is also developing a kind of mini-lateralism and triangular relation between Australia, India, and itself. And I would mention also that France is not afraid of organizing bigger naval exercise, including US, including all of the like-minded partner working within the Quad. And I will mention the exercise La Pérouse that France organized. It was in May, and gathering the participation on US, Japan, India and Australia. So you can see the evolution of many naval assets and the need and the will to show the flag and to increase interoperability and to be present, simply to be present at sea, to uphold the Convention of the Law of Montego Bay in this way, in very different way.
So we have 5 more minutes. I do not see any more questions. I don't know if a new one will appear. I would like to ask Hosoya-san questions about, it's a little bit not far away from our subject, but it's very important as a strategic issue today, is, as I mentioned before, the question of Taiwan, of course, was not an issue at the time of the San Francisco Treaty, and when the Republic of China signed an agreement, a treaty with Japan directly. How do you see, of course, there is this engagement from the US, more strategic ambiguity. And recently, some people in Japan made more specific declarations regarding Taiwan. So how do you see the evolution, or what Japan could do? Because this is an issue that all like-minded countries are sharing the same value. It will be a challenge that we have to prepare for. And to Taiwan, maybe, to Marianne, sorry, maybe, as you are a very important specialist on this question, how do you see the relations between Japan and South Korea being maybe a difficulty for the implementation of agreements and stability in Northeast Asia? I think that South Korea, not only North Korea, but South Korea has been extremely difficult, and maybe putting internally political issues before the necessity of strategic stability. So as a conclusion, after Hosoya-san answers, if you maybe have a few thoughts on this delicate subject that could be a threat to the balance of power and stability in East Asia. So first, concluding remarks, focusing on my question by Professor Hosoya, and then to Marianne.
Well, thank you very much, Valérie, for your important question, and I will give you a comment within a few minutes, 1 or 2 minutes. Taiwan is an extremely important issue, of course, nowadays, and Taiwan is important for several reasons. One is that Taiwan is a democratic power. That's why to abandon democracy has a significant meaning in the region. I don't think that the United States can abandon Taiwan because it's a democratic partner. This is one thing. Normatively, Taiwan is of course different from Afghanistan. United States has a very strong affiliation, strong affection as well to the Taiwan people. This is one thing. The other thing is geopolitically, the United States and Japan cannot abandon Taiwan, because if China has a Taiwan, it means that China can have much stronger naval influence in the region. Because Taiwan and Japan are kind of a gate, a barrier for Chinese PLA Navy. So if we lose that barrier, China has a much stronger influence and dominance in Pacific Ocean. And thirdly, more and more Taiwanese people has their own identity, national identity, different from continental China, because after 1945, a significant number of nationalists, Chinese people, actually came from continental Taiwan to Taiwan Island. But nowadays, more and more people are born in Taiwan. They have a strong affiliation in Taiwan democracy, Taiwan as a country. They do not have any affiliation with communist Chinese people. That's why, even though economically it is important for Taiwan to have a good relationship with Chinese continent, but less and less, I think that Taiwan try to become a part of continental China. So we will, the question is whether liberal democracies, United States, European countries, Japan can defend Taiwan. I think we can defend Taiwan.
Thank you very much. And now a few words of, I'm sorry, rapid conclusion to Marianne.
I really want to echo Hosoya-san's words regarding the vibrant democracies that represent Taiwan, which had a very instrumental role in the fight against COVID-19, and which have been continually marginalized by China during this period, and still now when it came to the International Health Organization. And I think that Taiwan could contribute in a more effective way. Well, there are political aspects, and as you mentioned, Hosoya-san, strategical aspect, and I do understand that if China took over the control of the Taiwan Strait, this is the road to the Pacific and to the military American installation in the Pacific that could be at threat. So for many reasons, Taiwan is really very important. And as I mentioned the Pacific, I would like to remind you that in the Indo-Pacific, you had Oceania and you had the Pacific. And I do concur with the centrality and the strategic centrality of ASEAN in the framework of the Indo-Pacific and in the elaboration of the Indo-Pacific concept for many players. But I would love you not to forget about the situation of the Pacific Islands, which are very vulnerable, isolated, and which are, you see, under pressure or a charm offensive from China.
Okay, so thank you very much to both of you. We finish on time, and thank you for the participants. And also, I remind you that this webinar is recorded and it will be on the FRS Japan program YouTube web channel. And so many of you will be able to watch it, and we will Twitter the link in a few days when it will be finalized. So once again, thank you very much. Hosoya, I wish you good, excellent holidays in Japan. And Marianne, goodbye, and thank you so much for participating. I know you have another meeting just after that. You are very busy.
Thank you so much.
So goodbye to all of you, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.